Hey, good morning. It's great to be in the house of the Lord with you this morning, especially to share the Lord's Supper. It's wonderful to be asked to be back. I think some of you at least know that I have actually retired from my position at Willow Network. And before I go into my message today regarding retirement, I just want to say I highly recommend it. It is something to look forward to, and once you get there, dive headlong into. But of course, it doesn't mean that we stop serving the Lord. He just opens other doors when you do it as a volunteer. So, for the past few years, Christine and I actually have been transitioning into a different kind of ministry, which I know a couple of years ago I alluded to. Reaching out to people who are experiencing the pain of loss of somebody that they love. And we do that primarily through the Grief Share program, which is a 13-week cycle that we do a couple times a year. And this summer, I was asked to give a message at the Church of Christ in Utica from one of my friends who heard that we were involved in reaching out to people that are grieving. And it was so well received that it seemed appropriate to take this message at least once to each of the churches that I'm asked to speak in, primarily for the purpose of better equipping all of us to be able to reach out and minister to people that are in a state of grieving at one stage or another. Now, I know to some of you, today's message may be might seem like a real sleeper. I get that. But at the core of what I have to share is the response to what is a very painful, disturbing life experience that at some point most of us in this room are going to go through. So instead of the typical sermon message that I would normally bring as an invited guest, today I just really felt convicted and led to want to have a very raw conversation about grief, broken down into two primary sections that will overlap a little bit. The first is more or less to define grief from the perspective of common experiences that people have. And the second section will focus more on how to help people that are in the midst of grieving. And to me, this, of course, will be the more important of the two. But before I go into the crux of my message, there are a few passages from the Bible that really speak to the issue in the way that I think we should all embrace. Psalm 34:18 tells us that the Lord is near to the brokenhearted. Matthew 5:4, Jesus promised that those who mourn will be comforted. Romans 12:15, the Apostle Paul tells us that we should shoulder up with people and mourn with those who mourn. And in 2 Corinthians 1:3 and 4, Paul tells us that God, in fact, is the Father of all compassion, who is willing to comfort us in all our troubles, so that we, in turn, can play an active role and reach out and help comfort others with the same comfort that God has bestowed on us. Now, as many of you know, my personal journey with grief primarily came on May 1st, 2020, when I lost my oldest daughter at age 37 to a drug overdose. And she died at a time when Christine and I lost a total of 7 other people within a 12 to 18 month period. 6 of them were family members, and 1 was a close friend from a church that we pastored in Madison County for about 9 years. Now, here's the interesting thing, what I learned through all of this. There are degrees of intensity when it comes to this issue of grief. And if you were to think about it from the perspective of measuring that intensity on a scale of 1 to 10, I will tell you, for the most part, there are a lot of times when people will pass away and we feel it, but it only hits us at a level of like maybe 1 or 2 or 3, and then we can rapidly move on. There are times when it's a little bit more intense, and maybe it hits us at a level of 4 or 5 or 6 because we had a closer relationship. But then there are times when it hits and you feel like your world has just been flipped upside down. That's how I felt when the call came in that Renee had passed away. And I'll tell you that I hit that scale on a 10 plus. And that, my friends, is how you know you are experiencing grief at the deepest level. When you have such a heavy burden over the loss of someone you love, or when your world is completely flipped upside down and you're not sure if or how you will be able to go back on with life, you are in the state of deep grief. And this is normal when you are so close to somebody that your world seems flipped upside down. It is completely normal. Grieving is a normal emotional experience that everyone goes through to some extent when we lose someone we love, and depending upon the severity, you can feel like you are losing your mind. In the second session of the Grief Share program, that particular section is the first of 2 that deal with some very specific challenges to grief. And a gentleman by the name of Mike shares this testimony. Mike said, "I was surprised at how intense grief was. You feel like you're going crazy. Your emotion takes over, your brain stops working, and in the midst of it, you're trying to make everybody around you feel like you're doing okay and that you're doing good. But then you go home, and when you're sitting there alone, you just cry and feel like, what do I do now?" In one of the most recent Grief Share sessions that Chris and I led, one of the guys that was in it felt exactly that way over the spouse that he lost after 30 years of marriage. This couple was so tied together. They read scripture together every day. They spent time praying together every day. They ministered to other people every day. And when God took her home, he was completely lost. 2 others, young ladies that went through the Grief Share program with us, felt that same way about losing their fathers. They had such a tight bond and a close relationship with their dads that the loss was absolutely devastating. When I lost Renee, I think I shared a couple years ago when I was here, I was so messed up emotionally, I did not know whether or not I could continue on in my role at Willow Network. Minutes seemed like hours. The heaviness seemed like it was never going to go away. And when you see the rest of the world going on and people having fun and enjoying time together and being with one another like we should, you are left with the reality that you will never again see the person you loved for as many days as you are walking the earth. And unfortunately, in this moment, in this painful experience called grief, it's something that most people try to deal with on their own and tend to want to hide from everybody else around them. We don't want people, I don't know if we're conditioned this way or if we just are naturally reclusive and don't want to share some of the greatest burdens, or if we're feeling like, we are burdening others when we share these things. But the bottom line is that we tend to want people to think that we're doing okay. We tend to want people to think that our faith is not failing. So instead of being honest with people and reaching out and seeking help, all too many of us try to muscle through it alone, which actually tends to prolong the pain and lengthen the recovery period. And yet, you're still stuck with the reality that you have to go back to work, the lawn needs to be mowed, or in the winter, the driveway needs to be shoveled, laundry needs to be cleaned, groceries need to be purchased, bills need to be paid. Life has to go on. But in the moment, many people find that they really have a hard time putting one foot in front of the other. The brain just becomes foggy. It cannot absorb as much as it can under normal circumstances. It's not uncommon for people to be driving down the street and suddenly wake up and wonder, where am I? And how did I get here? I had that experience myself one time. I've driven Route 5 from Sherrill to Utica thousands of times. And one day on my way home from the office, all of a sudden I'm looking around thinking, where am I? How did I get here? I had no clue where I was until all of a sudden I started seeing some familiar things. And the reason is because our brains are on such overload that you just don't function like normal. And things like this are very normal for people who are going through that deep state of grief. And when they start to occur, one of the most natural things we all want to know is, where exactly are we on the stages of grief? We want to know right where we are so we can figure out how to get to the other side as quickly as we possibly can. Well, let me tell you something. I remember watching this movie one time. I can't remember if it was like The Godfather or Scarface, but it was one of those, mafia Italian movies. And I can't remember exactly who the actor was or what they were doing or dressing, but at one point, this big, hairy Italian guy stands up and says, "Forget about it." By the way, I don't have anything against big, hairy Italian guys. Or small, hairy Italian guys, huh? Yeah. But while there are common emotions and things that we all encounter while we grieve, they are so random and so unorderly in occurrence, and they repeat themselves so many times over and over and over, and just come together like a tangled mess. Trying to figure out where exactly you are in these supposed stages of grief, forget about it. No two people grieve alike. While one person gets stuck in this area over here, someone else gets stuck in this area over here. It could be guilt. I heard one person in our group say many times that if only they had been there, her husband might still be alive. She was an RN. She knew medical practice. She knew she probably could have saved his life if she had been there. She was dealing with a tremendous amount of guilt just because she wasn't in the right place at the right time. I know one person felt a measure of guilt because she was relieved when her husband finally passed away. Not that he was a bad guy. She loved him dearly. But for 7 or 8 years, he was bedridden with dementia, and she was his primary caregiver. And as much as she missed him, she was relieved that finally she could just start taking care of herself instead of having to provide 24/7 care to her husband. Another was overwhelmed because she was married to a guy that did everything. And now she's stuck trying to figure out, how do I pay the bills online? How do I get my bank statements online? How do I make sure that my lawnmower and my snowblower are functional? How do I even operate them? She did not know what to do on a daily basis with many things because he did it all. And yet, I've also met other people that express forms of anger simply because they didn't have a chance to say goodbye. These are all very common emotions. It's all a part of grieving. And studies show that for most people, it takes 6 to 9 months just to accept the death of the person that they loved and acclimate to their new normal. 6 to 9 months just to accept the new reality, and 4 to 5 years before they begin to fully recover from the loss, except in the case of a child where it's extended to 5 to 10 years and sometimes even more. So this common experience that we are all going to have someday is very long-lasting. And one of the things I've learned is that the last thing we should do as people who are concerned about our family, our friends, or people within the church or the community, we need to try hard not to rush them through it. We need to understand that everybody grieves differently, and it can take a long, long time to recover. One spouse, for example, may hold on to their loved one's clothing and their belongings for years before they clean the closet. Well, another one might say, you know, these clothes aren't doing any good here. I think my spouse or my child would be really happy to know that we have given them to people that could use them and take them to the rescue mission or to the Salvation Army. Is either one of those right or wrong? Absolutely not. They're both right. And with that in mind, we should try to seek to empower, to help them make the decision that is most right for them. And conversely, we don't want to rush a person to do things that they're not ready for or hinder them from moving forward. Whatever they choose to do, as long as it's not detrimental to their health, their welfare, or their spiritual life, is part of the healing process. And to help them heal, to help them recover, I just want to encourage all of us to do one thing really well, and that is to be present for them. Because once the funeral is over, people go on with their lives, but people who are grieving are often sitting home by themselves in complete loneliness. Siblings go home, children go back to work or back to school, and you are stuck with yourself with no one to talk to. So I encourage you, when you hear of somebody that may have lost a loved one or know of somebody, go out of your way to be present for them. Ask if there is anything you can do for them that will be helpful or supportive. If you see their lawn needs mowing, you can skip one game of golf to go out and mow their lawn. We can take a day off here and a day off there to make sure that their driveway is plowed or snowblowed or whatever the case may be. You know, they might say they don't want it done. Maybe they want to be alone, or maybe they want to do it themselves to take their mind off the pain that they're experiencing. But I'll tell you what, when you go out of your way to help somebody that's in pain like that, they will never forget that you asked and offered to help. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to share a couple of what I would call do's and don'ts, and you've got to know I have made every one of these mistakes. I have, as a pastor, as a friend, as just an average guy in the community, when ministering or trying to help people that have lost somebody, I have made every mistake you can think of, including some of the things I'm going to share today, simply because I did not comprehend or understand the depth of what they were going through. There's statements that we typically say, it's tempting to very compassionately say, I know how you feel. I've heard a couple chuckles, yeah, because you know. They don't know how you feel. It's true. We want to avoid making that statement because at the bottom line is we don't know how an individual feels. Try hard not to say things like, oh, it's for the best, or at least they're pain-free. All of those stem from a very compassionate heart, and they sound very compassionate. But right now, when someone's in that midst of grief, that best that we are trying to communicate might be very, very painful for the survivors. Again, these are common mistakes I know I've made over and over. Prior to losing Renee, I never knew what deep grief felt like. And I said those things all the time. But if the door opens, I guess maybe one thing I've done right, and probably all of you have done the same thing, is just to encourage people to turn to God and to seek for His help because He promises to be there for those who will. Offer to pray for them. But can I encourage you to keep it really short? Just God, please help my brother get through this painful moment is enough. I tell you the truth, people in deep grief cannot handle much more. And in the mix, try to do your best to avoid those quick and easy Bible quote responses that we are prone and sometimes conditioned to give in normal circumstances to encourage each other, right? But when you're in the midst of grief, it's a different ballgame. The Apostle Paul may have said, we don't grieve like others without hope, but he didn't say we don't grieve at all. Grieving is a very long, painful, confusing process during which time people respond best to being shown love and support. And even a well-intended Bible quote can put a wall between you and the person that you are trying to help simply because they are in so much pain. I've heard that over and over and over from people in our grief share groups. And when it comes to the spiritual side of things, try with your best to not challenge a person's theological convictions. It is better in this moment to be a student than to be a professor. I've heard stories from people in our group of people that would challenge them on whether or not their loved one was in heaven. Oh man, it's not the time. It's just not the time. Save that conversation for another decade. You know, I've even heard testimonies from people, and maybe some of you can relate to this, when you lost someone you loved, they couldn't even find the energy to read their Bible or to pray other than, God, please make the pain go away. It's a very tough moment when you lose someone you love. So I encourage you today, and I especially encourage you during the holiday seasons, because there's more suicides during the holiday season triggered by depression and deep pain than at any other time of the year. Be an encourager. Comfort others with the comfort that you've received in similar situations. But again, try to avoid those challenges or quick Bible verses, even though in another circumstance they could be very true. They might not be well timed. or what the person really needs right then and there, which is love, compassion, and understanding. And the last suggestion on my do's and don't list, if you will, I found this to be very helpful. Instead of asking a person how they're doing, instead, ask them how they are doing today. And I want to share a brief example of how I learned how important this was. And Sean, if you don't mind, I'm just going to share a little story about your mom. So Sean's mom was a volunteer at CareNet Willow Network for many years. And as you all know, she lost her husband, Sean lost his dad. And I hadn't seen Karen for about a year or a year and a half. And when she came to one of our training sessions one morning, you know, I can be a bonehead sometimes. I like to try and be a K-Love type person, positive and encouraging, you know. So Karen came to the session and I was like, Karen, it's so good to see you. How you doing? And without a word, the look on her face was, what is wrong with you? Right? Well, I didn't know. But I found out on May 1st, 2020. And I actually, a couple of years after Renee passed, and I finally got to a point where I could have a conversation about things, I went to Karen and I asked her forgiveness. She just kind of chuckled at that point and said, don't worry about it. I understood what an idiot you were. But in the grand scheme of things, at some point, and it could be during the holiday seasons, you know, we are all going to lose somebody that we love dearly, dearly, dearly. And the holiday seasons in particular can be very challenging. But let's be honest, it's pretty rare that we are prone to educate ourselves in advance on either what to expect when it happens to us, or how to help somebody who's in the thick of things. So perhaps as family members of God's eternal kingdom, as children of the Father of all mercy and compassion, we could take this more seriously on an individual level and educate ourselves a little bit better on what to expect and how to help people. Because, as I've said over and over, it's going to happen to every one of us at some point. And wouldn't it be nice if during that moment we can either receive or give the kind of help and support that will actually help us get through it and come out healthier as a result than if we hadn't had that support and love. So thank you for, I hope I didn't put anybody to sleep this morning, but thank you for having me. I have a sheet that I'm going to leave that you guys can make copies of. It's called The Art of Condolence, and it has a whole bunch of things on here, some of which I used today. Feel free to copy it. Am I supposed to stay up here and pray for something, Ron?